Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 8 of our complete practice question series for the SC-100 Microsoft Cybersecurity Architect Expert exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends. Then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 8. Question number 273. Scenario. An organization protects business-critical Azure workloads with Azure Backup. Its ransomware resilience strategy must preserve recently deleted recovery points and prevent a single compromised backup administrator from unilaterally disabling protection or deleting backups. The solution must use modern architectural standards over legacy prompt mechanisms. Which two controls should the architect recommend? Select 2. The available options are as follows. Option A. Require a legacy security pin for critical backup operations. Option B. Enable soft delete for protected backup items. Option C. Encrypt every backup exclusively with a customer-managed key. Option D. Enable multi-user authorization, MUA, through Azure Backup Resource Guard. Option E. Rely only on diagnostic log alerts after backup settings are changed. The correct answers are Option B. Enable soft delete for protected backup items, and Option D. Enable multi-user authorization, MUA, through Azure Backup Resource Guard. Here's why. Soft delete ensures deleted recovery points are retained for a grace period. Multi-user authorization, MUA, with Resource Guard represents the modern architectural standard for preventing a single compromised administrator from executing critical/destructive backup operations. Why are the other options not correct? A. Legacy security pins have been largely superseded by MUA/Resource Guard for robust administrative protection. C. Customer-managed keys provide data confidentiality, but do not stop a malicious admin with proper RBAC from deleting backups. E. Notifications are purely detective and will not prevent a destructive action. Exam tip. MUA with Resource Guard is the modern architectural standard for preventing unilateral destructive actions in Azure Backup. Question number 274. Scenario. A company hosts public Azure App Service applications in a single European region. The applications must be protected from malicious scanners and automated bots by using managed web application rules. The solution must reduce direct exposure of the applications. Which Azure service should the architect recommend? The available options are as follows. Option A. Azure Application Gateway with Web Application Firewall. Option B. Azure Traffic Manager with Application Security Groups. Option C. Network Security Groups assigned to the App Service applications. Option D. Azure Firewall Premium without a Web Application Firewall. The correct answer is Option A. Azure Application Gateway with Web Application Firewall. Here's why. Application Gateway WAF provides regional Layer 7 protection for the App Service applications. Its managed rule sets and bot manager rules can identify and block malicious scanners and automated bot traffic. Why are the other options not correct? B. Traffic Manager provides DNS-based routing, and application security groups do not inspect HTTP requests. C. NSGS do not provide managed bot or web application attack detection for App Service. D. Azure Firewall Premium is not a replacement for an HTTP-focused WAF in this scenario. Exam tip. Use WAF for HTTP and HTTPS application attacks and bot manager rules for automated malicious traffic. Question number 275. Scenario. An organization places Azure Front Door in front of an Azure App Service application. The origin must accept requests only from the organization's specific front door profile. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Statement 1. Allowing the Azure Front Door backend service tag without validating the front door profile identifier restricts the origin to one specific front door profile. Statement 1. Allowing the Azure Front Door backend service tag without validating the front door profile identifier restricts the origin to one specific front door profile. The answer is no. The origin must also validate the profile-specific Azure FDID value. Exam tip. Combine the front door backend service tag with Azure FDID validation to restrict an origin to a specific profile. Question number 276. Scenario. An Azure App Service application is published through Azure Front Door. The origin must reject direct internet requests and strictly reject requests forwarded by any other unauthorized front door profile. Which two configurations must the architect combine to provide the complete recommended origin restriction? Select 2. The available options are as follows. Option A. Restrict inbound traffic to the Azure Front Door backend service tag. Option B. Validate that the Azure FDID header matches the organization's specific front door profile. Option C. Configure an app service access restriction for the Internet Service tag. Option D. Require a Microsoft Entra ID managed identity for inbound front door connections. Option E. Configure an app service access restriction for the Azure Front Door front-end service tag. The correct answers are Option A. Restrict inbound traffic to the Azure Front Door backend service tag, and Option B. Validate that the Azure FDID header matches the organization's specific front door profile. Here's why. Securing a front door origin requires a strict combination of controls. The Azure Front Door backend service tag ensures traffic originates from front door infrastructure, while validating the Azure FDID header prevents traffic from bypassing your specific profile through another tenant's front door deployment. Why are the other options not correct? C. Allowing the Internet Service tag defeats the purpose of forcing traffic through front door. D. Managed identities are not used to authenticate inbound traffic passing from front door to app service origins. E. Azure Front Door frontend is not the correct service tag for traffic arriving at the origin from the front door backend. Exam tip. Missing either the service tag restriction or the Azure FDID header validation leaves the origin vulnerable to spoofing or bypass. Always combine both. Question number 277. Scenario. A regulated application stores data in Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL. Auditors must be able to associate data plane operations with Microsoft Entra identities. Shared account keys must not permit anonymous to the user access, and data plane request records must be retained centrally. Which two configurations should the architect recommend? Select 2. The available options are as follows. Option A. Enable Microsoft Defender for identity. Option B. Disable local key-based authentication for the Azure Cosmos DB account. Option C. Export Microsoft Entra sign-in logs without collecting Cosmos DB data plane logs. Option D. Send Azure Cosmos DB data plane diagnostic logs to a log analytics workspace. Option E. Enable Microsoft Defender for Cosmos DB without changing authentication or diagnostic settings. The correct answers are Option B. Disable local key-based authentication for the Azure Cosmos DB account, and Option D. Send Azure Cosmos DB data plane diagnostic logs to a log analytics workspace. Here's why. Disabling local authentication requires clients to use Microsoft Entra identities instead of shared account keys. Cosmos DB data plane diagnostic logs then provide centrally retained request records for auditing access and operations. Why are the other options not correct? A. Defender for Identity protects Active Directory identities and does not audit Cosmos DB data access. C. Entra sign-in logs alone do not provide the Cosmos DB data plane operation trail. E. Defender for Cosmos DB detects threats, but does not replace identity enforcement and diagnostic logging. Exam tip. For attributable Cosmos DB access, require Microsoft Entra authentication and collect data plane diagnostic logs. Question number 278. Scenario. A financial services company is defining vulnerability management requirements for container workloads protected by Microsoft Defender for containers. The architecture must assess container images before deployment and specifically provide runtime vulnerability assessment for deployed Linux pods within an Azure Kubernetes service, AKS, cluster. Which two environments should the architect include in the vulnerability assessment design to meet these requirements? Select 2. The available options are as follows. Option A. Container images running in Azure Container Instances. Option B. Container images stored in Azure Container Registry. Option C. Windows container images running on Azure Kubernetes Service nodes. Option D. Linux container images running in Azure Kubernetes Service. Option E. Container images stored in an external registry not connected to Azure. The correct answers are Option B. Container images stored in Azure Container Registry, and Option D. Linux container images running in Azure Kubernetes Service. Here's why. Defender for Containers assesses images stored in Azure Container Registry and provides runtime vulnerability assessment for supported Linux container images running in Azure Kubernetes Service clusters via the Defender daemon set. Why are the other options not correct? A. Azure Container Instances, ACI, does not support the Defender daemon set required for runtime vulnerability assessment. C. Runtime vulnerability assessment via the daemon set is focused on Linux nodes/pods. Windows AKS nodes do not support the same native runtime vulnerability agent architecture. E. Images held in an unconnected external registry are outside the specified Defender for Cloud Registry Assessment scope. Exam tip. Distinguish Registry Vulnerability Assessment, ACR, from Runtime Vulnerability Assessment, Linux pods in AKS, when designing for Defender for Containers. Question number 279. Scenario. A legal services company operates an internal claims application that uses integrated Windows authentication and Kerberos. Employees working remotely use personally owned Windows devices. The company wants to publish only the application, apply Microsoft intra-conditional access, and provide single sign-on without extending general network access to the devices. Which capability should the security architect recommend? The available options are as follows. Option A, Microsoft Tunnel. Option B, Azure Virtual WAN. Option C, Microsoft Intra-Application Proxy. Option D, Web Content Filtering in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. The correct answer is Option C, Microsoft Intra-Application Proxy. Here's why. Microsoft Intra-Application Proxy publishes an on-premises web application without exposing the broader network. It supports conditional access and can provide single sign-on to Kerberos applications through Kerberos constrained delegation. Why are the other options not correct? A. Microsoft Tunnel provides mobile device access to corporate resources and does not directly publish a Kerberos web application with intra-pre-authentication. B. Azure Virtual WAN provides network connectivity and transit architecture rather than application-specific zero-trust access. D. Web content filtering controls web destinations on protected endpoints, but does not publish an internal application. Exam tip. Use application proxy when users need identity-aware access to a specific on-premises web application without general network connectivity. Question number 280. Scenario. A manufacturing company is migrating several standalone SQL Server databases to Azure. The target platform must remove responsibility for operating system and database engine patching, support dynamic data masking, and provide the lowest cost service that satisfies these requirements. Instance-level compatibility is not required. Which Azure database service should the architect recommend? The available options are as follows. Option A, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. Option B, Azure SQL Database. Option C, Azure SQL Managed Instance. Option D, Azure Synapse Analytics Dedicated SQL Pool. The correct answer is Option B, Azure SQL Database. Here's why. Azure SQL Database is a fully managed platform service that removes operating system and database engine patching responsibilities, supports dynamic data masking, and is generally the lowest cost suitable choice when instance-level compatibility is unnecessary. Why are the other options not correct? A. SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines retains substantial operating system and SQL Server maintenance responsibility. C. Azure SQL Managed Instance provides broader instance compatibility, but normally costs more than necessary for independent databases. D. A dedicated SQL pool is designed for analytical data warehousing rather than economical migration of transactional databases. Exam tip. Choose Azure SQL Database for managed relational databases unless instance-level SQL Server compatibility is a stated requirement. Question number 281. Scenario. An organization will host administrative workloads in 5 Azure virtual networks. Core VNet is paired with App VNet 1 and App VNet 2. A separate Scale VNet 1 is paired only with Scale VNet 2. No peering or routed connection exists between the Core VNet group and the Scale VNet group. Administrators must securely connect to every virtual machine by using Azure Bastion. What is the minimum number of Azure Bastion subnets required by this topology? The available options are as follows. Option A 1. Option B 2. Option C 3. Option D 4. Option E 5. The correct answer is option B 2. Here's why. One Bastion deployment can provide access to virtual machines in its virtual network and supported peered virtual networks. The topology contains 2 disconnected peering groups, so each group requires its own Azure Bastion subnet and Bastion deployment. Why are the other options not correct? A. One deployment cannot traverse between the 2 disconnected virtual network groups. C. 3 subnets are unnecessary because the 3 networks in the first group can share one deployment. D. 4 deployments would duplicate Bastion within connected peering groups. E. A separate deployment in every virtual network is not required. Exam tip. Count isolated connectivity domains, not individual virtual networks, when sizing Bastion deployments for peered architectures. Question number 282. Scenario. A software company is creating a DevSecretary standard for containerized applications. Security analysis must occur when developers contribute code, scanning for vulnerabilities and secrets in the repository, and again while deployment images are built in the continuous integration pipeline. Complete each recommendation by selecting the most appropriate capability. Complete each statement by selecting the appropriate option from its drop-down list. Statement 1. To analyze repository code for vulnerabilities before it is merged, integrate the blank. The choices for Statement 1 are GitHub Advanced Security, Azure Boards, or Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Statement 2. To execute security analysis as the container image is built, integrate the blank. The choices for Statement 2 are Azure Pipelines, Azure Boards, or Microsoft Entra ID. For Statement 1, the correct selection is GitHub Advanced Security. GHAS provides native code scanning and secret scanning capabilities within the GitHub development workflow. For Statement 2, the correct selection is Azure Pipelines. Security tools and Microsoft Security DevOps tasks execute as part of the CI pipeline. Exam tip. Repository scanning belongs in the source control workflow, GitHub Advanced Security. Build and image checks belong in the continuous integration pipeline, Azure Pipelines/GitHub Actions. Question number 283. Scenario. A healthcare organization requires Azure SQL data files to be encrypted with AES 256. The organization must control the key encryption key and rotate it every month. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Statement 1. Configure transparent data encryption with a customer-managed key in Azure Key Vault. Enable automatic TD protector rotation and apply a monthly key vault rotation policy. Statement 1. Configure transparent data encryption with a customer-managed key in Azure Key Vault. Enable automatic TD protector rotation and apply a monthly key vault rotation policy. The answer is yes. The design combines AES 256 data at rest encryption with organization-controlled monthly rotation of the customer-managed TD protector. Exam tip. Separate the database encryption key from its customer-managed protector when evaluating TD rotation requirements. Question number 284. Scenario. An Azure storage account contains application data that must be accessed by 24 externally hosted processing servers. Each server uses a known static public IP address. The blob service will remain reachable through its public endpoint, but all other internet clients must be denied. Which control should the architect recommend? The available options are as follows. Option A, Network Security Group rules that use Azure Service Tags. Option B, Azure Firewall Destination Network Address Translation rules. Option C, IP network rules in the storage account firewall. Option D, managed rule sets in an Azure Web Application Firewall policy. Option E, inbound network security group rules applied to an Azure subnet. The correct answer is option C, IP network rules in the storage account firewall. Here's why. The storage account firewall can allow requests from the fixed public IP addresses of the approved servers and deny traffic from other internet sources at the storage service boundary. Why are the other options not correct? A. Service tags identify Azure services, not an arbitrary set of external server public IP addresses. B. Azure Firewall DNAT does not control direct access to the storage account's public endpoint. D. Web Application Firewall protects HTTP applications behind supported application delivery services, not native blob storage authorization. E. An NSG controls interfaces and subnets in a virtual network and is not attached to the public storage endpoint. Exam tip. Use storage firewall IP rules when a public storage endpoint must be limited to known external public addresses. Question number 285. Scenario. An engineering team is designing an internet-facing application. Before selecting security controls, the team will use the Microsoft Threat Modeling tool to identify trust boundaries, processes, external entities, and movement of information. Which diagram should the team create? The available options are as follows. Option A, network flow diagram. Option B, data flow diagram. Option C, business process flow diagram. Option D, system workflow diagram. The correct answer is option B, data flow diagram. Here's why. The Microsoft Threat Modeling tool represents processes, data stores, external entities, trust boundaries, and data flows in a data flow diagram so that threats can be identified systematically. Why are the other options not correct? A. A network flow diagram focuses on network paths and does not represent the complete threat modeling notation. C. A business process flow diagram documents operational workflows rather than security trust boundaries and data movement. D. A system workflow diagram is not the diagram type used by the Microsoft Threat Modeling tool. Exam tip. In Microsoft Threat Modeling, identify threats by modeling data flows, processes, stores, external entities, and trust boundaries. Question number 286. Scenario. An Azure App Service application must connect to one on-premises SQL server endpoint over TCP. The company has no site-to-site VPN or ExpressRoute circuit and does not want to expose a broadly accessible inbound endpoint or provide the application with access to the rest of the corporate network. Which connectivity capability should the architect recommend? The available options are as follows. Option A, an Azure private endpoint for the App Service application. Option B, App Service hybrid connections. Option C, App Service virtual network integration. Option D, virtual network integration with an Azure NAT gateway. The correct answer is option B, App Service hybrid connections. Here's why. Hybrid connections lets an app service application establish outbound connectivity to a specific TCP host and port through Azure Relay. It does not require a VPN or ExpressRoute connection and avoids granting access to the wider on-premises network. Why are the other options not correct? A. A private endpoint provides private inbound access to an Azure service. It does not connect app service to an on-premises SQL endpoint. C. Virtual network integration requires a network path from the integrated virtual network to the on-premises environment. D. A NAT gateway controls outbound source translation but does not create connectivity to an isolated on-premises network. Exam tip. Use hybrid connections for narrow app service access to specific on-premises TCP endpoints when private network connectivity is unavailable. Question number 287. Scenario. A development team has deployed a test instance of an Azure App Service application. The security team must actively probe the running application for cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and insecure web server configuration. Which testing approach should be included in the application security strategy? The available options are as follows. Option A, static application security testing. Option B, runtime application self-protection. Option C, Dynamic application security testing. Option D. Interactive application security testing. The correct answer is option C. Dynamic application security testing. Here's why. Dynamic application security testing probes a running application from the outside and can identify exploitable conditions such as SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and insecure server configuration. Why are the other options not correct? A. Static testing analyzes source code or compiled artifacts without exercising the running application. B. Runtime application self-protection is an in-application defensive control rather than an external vulnerability testing method. D. Interactive testing combines runtime observation with instrumentation, but is not the standard external black box test described. Exam tip. Choose DSD when the requirement is to attack test a running web application through its exposed interfaces. Question number 288. Scenario. An external auditor requires read-only access to one blob for 48 hours. The blob must not be made anonymously accessible, and the auditor must not receive the storage account key. Which access mechanism should the architect recommend? The available options are as follows. Option A. Share the storage account connection string. Option B. Issue a user delegation shared access signature scope to the blob and expiration time. Option C. Create a private endpoint for the storage account. Option D. Encrypt the storage account with a customer-managed key. The correct answer is option B. Issue a user delegation shared access signature scope to the blob and expiration time. Here's why. A user delegation SAS grants restricted, time-limited access to the designated blob without making it public or exposing the storage account key. Why are the other options not correct? A. A connection string containing an account key grants excessive access and exposes a long-lived credential. C. Private link supplies private network connectivity but does not by itself grant the external auditor temporary authorization. D. A customer-managed key controls encryption and does not provide blob-level temporary access. Exam tip. Use a narrowly scoped SAS with minimum permissions and a short expiration for temporary external access to storage data. Question number 289. Scenario. A regulated workload stores documents in Azure Blob Storage. Policy requires the organization to enforce a customer-defined 30-day key rotation interval. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Statement 1. Use a Microsoft-managed key in an Azure storage encryption scope and rely on Microsoft's key rotation schedule to satisfy the mandatory customer-defined 30-day interval. Statement 1. Use a Microsoft-managed key in an Azure storage encryption scope and rely on Microsoft's key rotation schedule to satisfy the mandatory customer-defined 30-day interval. The answer is no. A customer-defined rotation schedule requires control of a customer-managed key rather than reliance on Microsoft-managed rotation. Exam tip. Choose customer-managed keys when policy requires the organization to control key ownership, rotation timing, or revocation. Question number 290. Scenario. An enterprise is formalizing its application onboarding standard according to the Microsoft Security Development Lifecycle. The design stage must identify credible threats, trust boundaries, and required mitigations before developers implement the application. Which activities should be required during the design stage? The available options are as follows. Option A. Perform dynamic application security testing against the staging environment. Option B. Create a threat model by using the Microsoft Threat Modeling tool. Option C. Run static application security testing after source code is implemented. Option D. Decompose compiled application binaries by using Microsoft Visual Studio Enterprise. The correct answer is option B. Create a threat model by using the Microsoft Threat Modeling tool. Here's why. Threat modeling is performed during design to identify assets, entry points, trust boundaries, threats, and mitigations before implementation decisions become difficult to change. Why are the other options not correct? A. DSD requires a running application and belongs to testing or verification activities. C. SC evaluates implemented source code and therefore occurs after development has begun. D. Binary decomposition is not the SDL design activity used to identify architectural threats. Exam tip. Threat model during design. Use static and dynamic testing later to validate the implemented controls. Question number 291. Scenario. A retailer is designing the identity architecture for a consumer-facing portal hosted in Azure App Service. They are migrating to Microsoft Entra External ID, Customer Identity, and Access Management to manage customer identities. The architecture must actively mitigate credential stuffing attacks, detect leaked credentials, and enforce contextual access decisions, such as requiring MFA or blocking access based on sign-in risk. Which two controls should the architect recommend? Select 2. The available options are as follows. Option A. Configure Microsoft Entra ID protection to detect and remediate risky customer sign-ins. Option B. Implement a Resource Owner Password Credentials (ROPC) flow for the application. Option C. Integrate Microsoft Entra Conditional Access to enforce contextual access controls. Option D. Govern customer access through Microsoft Entra Entitlement Management Access Packages. Option E. Use Azure Monitor Workbooks as the sole control for mitigating suspicious authentication. The correct answers are Option A. Configure Microsoft Entra ID protection to detect and remediate risky customer sign-ins, and Option C. Integrate Microsoft Entra Conditional Access to enforce contextual access controls. Here's why. For modern external identities, Microsoft Entra External ID/SAM, Microsoft Entra ID protection provides native capabilities to detect identity risks, such as leaked credentials or anonymous IP use. Conditional access integrates with these risk signals and other context, location, device, to enforce policies like requiring MFA or blocking the sign-in. Why are the other options not correct? B. Resource Owner Password Credentials, ROPC, bypass modern interactive protections, increasing the risk of credential stuffing, and should not be used. D. Entitlement Management Access Packages govern internal or B2B guest access to organizational resources, not primary B2C/CIM consumer authentication protections. E. Workbooks provide visibility and reporting, but cannot proactively prevent or enforce responses to identity attacks. Exam tip. Modern consumer identity architecture, Entra External ID, leverages Entra ID protection for risk detection and conditional access for enforcement, superseding legacy B2C custom policies. Question number 292. Scenario. A company with Microsoft 365 E5 wants security analysts to inspect where documents and messages containing sensitive information types are located across Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and Microsoft Teams. Which Microsoft Purview capability should the architect recommend for this visibility? The available options are as follows. Option A. Microsoft Purview eDiscovery. Option B. Microsoft Purview Content Explorer. Option C. Microsoft Purview Data Loss Prevention Policies. Option D. Microsoft Purview Records Management. The correct answer is Option B. Microsoft Purview Content Explorer. Here's why. Content Explorer provides visibility into classified and sensitive items and lets authorized analysts examine where sensitive information is stored across supported Microsoft 365 locations. Why are the other options not correct? A. eDiscovery supports legal investigation, preservation, search, and review rather than routine exploration of classified content. C. Data loss prevention enforces policies on sensitive information, but is not primarily the inventory and exploration interface requested. D. Records management governs retention and records lifecycle rather than locating documents by sensitive information type. Exam tip. Use classification explorers for visibility. Use DLP when the requirement is to restrict or monitor sensitive data use. Question number 293. Scenario. A company publishes an Azure App Service application through one designated Azure front door profile. Direct access and access through other customers' front door profiles must be blocked. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Statement 1. Add an app service access restriction rule that allows the Azure front door backend service tag without filtering the Azure FDID header. This ensures that only the designated front door profile can reach the application. Statement 1. Add an app service access restriction rule that allows the Azure front door backend service tag without filtering the Azure FDID header. This ensures that only the designated front door profile can reach the application. The answer is no. The service tag should be combined with validation of the profile-specific front door identifier to isolate the approved instance. Exam tip. For app service behind front door, combine the backend service tag with Azure FDID, filtering to restrict traffic to a specific profile. Question number 294. Scenario. A hybrid organization uses Microsoft Entra ID for cloud authentication and Active Directory domain services, ADDS, for on-premises authentication. The security architecture requires specialized detection for cloud identity risk, for example, leaked credentials, anonymous IP sign-ins, and attacks against domain identities, for example, pass the ticket, lateral movement. Complete each recommendation by selecting the most appropriate Microsoft security capability. Complete each statement by selecting the appropriate option from its drop-down list. Statement 1. To detect and remediate risky users and risky sign-ins in Microsoft Entra ID, deploy the blank. The choices for Statement 1 are Microsoft Entra ID Protection, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, or Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Statement 2. To detect credential theft and lateral movement targeting on-premises Active Directory domain services, deploy the blank. The choices for Statement 2 are Microsoft Defender for Identity, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, or Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. For Statement 1, the correct selection is Microsoft Entra ID Protection. Provides cloud identity risk detections and automated risk-based remediation capabilities. For Statement 2, the correct selection is Microsoft Defender for Identity. Monitors ADDS domain controllers to detect specialized on-premises identity attacks. Exam tip. Use Entra ID Protection for cloud identity risk, Entra ID, and Defender for Identity for attacks involving on-premises infrastructure, ADDS. Question number 295. Scenario. A managed security provider administers Azure subscriptions belonging to several customer tenants and also governs Windows and Linux servers in customer data centers. The provider wants centralized, delegated cloud administration and Azure-based management of non-Azure servers. Complete the architecture by selecting the most appropriate service for each requirement. Complete each statement by selecting the appropriate option from its drop-down list. Statement 1. For delegated administration of subscriptions across multiple customer tenants from one managing tenant, use the blank. The choices for Statement 1 are Azure Lighthouse, Microsoft Entra B2B Collaboration, or Azure Active Directory B2C. Statement 2. To project on-premises servers into Azure Management and Governance, use the blank. The choices for Statement 2 are Azure Arc, Azure Stack Edge, or Azure Stack Hub. For Statement 1, the correct selection is Azure Lighthouse. It provides cross-tenant delegated resource management without requiring ordinary guest administration in each tenant. For Statement 2, the correct selection is Azure Arc. It registers non-Azure servers as Azure resources for centralized governance and service integration. Exam tip. Azure Lighthouse addresses cross-tenant delegation. Azure Arc extends Azure management to resources outside Azure. Question number 296. Scenario. A pharmaceutical company stores highly regulated information in SharePoint Online and Exchange Online. The security architecture must meet the following self-contained requirements. 1. Make access decisions based on the user's identity, device compliance, location, and calculated sign-in risk. 2. Apply real-time session controls that monitor activity and block sensitive file downloads if the user connects from an unmanaged device. Which two services should the architect integrate? Select 2. The available options are as follows. Option A, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Option B, Microsoft Entra Access Reviews. Option C, Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. Option D, Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Option E, Microsoft Intra-Conditional Access. The correct answers are option C, Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, and option E, Microsoft Intra-Conditional Access. Here's why. Conditional access evaluates the initial sign-in context, identity, device, location, and risk. By integrating it with Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, the architecture can route the user's session through conditional access app control. This proxy applies real-time monitoring and enforces session controls, such as blocking sensitive file downloads on unmanaged devices. Why are the other options not correct? A. Defender for Endpoint provides device-level protection, but does not act as the proxy for Microsoft 365 real-time session controls. B. Access reviews periodically audit permissions, but do not enforce real-time sign-in or session conditions. D. Defender for Cloud protects Azure/multi-cloud infrastructure and workloads, not SaaS session routing for SharePoint or Exchange. Exam tip. Combine intra-conditional access for the access decision with Defender for Cloud Apps, conditional access app control, when requirements specify real-time session monitoring or download restrictions. Question number 297. Scenario. An Azure App Service application is published through a specific Azure front door profile. The security team must prevent all clients from bypassing that profile and reaching the application directly. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Statement 1. Configure gateway-required virtual network integration on the App Service application to ensure that all inbound requests can arrive only through the specified Azure front door profile. Statement 1. Configure gateway-required virtual network integration on the App Service application to ensure that all inbound requests can arrive only through the specified Azure front door profile. The answer is no. Inbound enforcement requires App Service access restrictions or private origin architecture, not outbound virtual network integration. Exam tip. App Service virtual network integration is primarily outbound. Use inbound access controls to prevent front door bypass. Question number 298. Scenario. A media company protects several hundred on-premises VMware and Hyper-V virtual machines by using Microsoft Azure Backup Server. The security team is concerned that an attacker who compromises a backup administrator account could stop protection and remove cloud recovery points. Which control should the cybersecurity architect include to strengthen protection against destructive backup operations? The available options are as follows. Option A. Encrypt the backup data by using customer-managed keys. Option B. Require a security PIN for critical backup management operations. Option C. Replicate the protected virtual machines to additional hypervisor hosts. Option D. Configure geo-redundant storage for every protected workload. The correct answer is option B. Require a security PIN for critical backup management operations. Here's why. Azure Backup security features can require a portal-generated PIN for critical operations affecting protected hybrid backups. This adds separate authorization before an attacker can perform destructive actions such as stopping protection and deleting backup data. Why are the other options not correct? A. Encryption protects confidentiality, but does not stop a compromised administrator from deleting recovery points. C. Additional source virtual machines are not protected recovery points and may be compromised by the same attack. D. Geo-redundancy protects against regional storage failure, but does not authorize destructive backup operations. Exam tip. For ransomware resilience, distinguish backup availability controls from controls that protect backup management operations. Question number 299. Scenario. A multinational managed security provider operates a central SOC for subsidiaries that use separate Microsoft intratenants. The architecture must satisfy three explicit, self-contained requirements. 1. Security logs must remain physically stored in approved geographic regions to comply with strict data residency laws. 2. Tenant isolation must be maintained at the log storage level. 3. Analysts in the managing tenant require delegated, cross-tenant access to investigate incidents across each subsidiary's Azure subscriptions. Complete the SIEM architecture by selecting the most appropriate design for each requirement. Complete each statement by selecting the appropriate option from its drop-down list. Statement 1. To preserve both tenant isolation and regional data residency boundaries, segment Microsoft Sentinel workspaces by the blank. The choices for Statement 1 are region and Microsoft intratenant, Microsoft intratenant only, or the entire enterprise. Statement 2. To provide the central SOC with delegated cross-tenant management of Azure subscriptions, use the blank. The choices for Statement 2 are Azure Lighthouse subscription onboarding, Microsoft Intra B2B self-service sign-up, or an external ID customer user flow. For Statement 1, the correct selection is region and Microsoft intratenant. Separate workspaces maintain the required geographic and tenant boundaries. For Statement 2, the correct selection is Azure Lighthouse subscription onboarding. Azure Lighthouse delegates resource management to identities in the managing tenant. Exam tip. Use workspace boundaries for sovereignty or ownership requirements and Azure Lighthouse for cross-tenant SOC administration. Question number 300. Scenario. A financial institution wants to protect sensitive data from being stolen by departing employees. The security team wants an architecture where data loss prevention, DLP, policies are dynamically tightened. For example, blocking USB transfers automatically when a user's risk level elevates due to anomalous behavior, such as downloading excessive files. You need to design a solution that leverages Microsoft Purview Adaptive Protection. Which two core Microsoft Purview components must you integrate to enable adaptive protection? Select 2. The available options are as follows. Option A, Microsoft Purview Data Lifecycle Management. Option B, Microsoft Purview Insider Risk Management. Option C, Microsoft Purview Data Loss Prevention, DLP. Option D, Microsoft Purview eDiscovery, Premium. Option E, Microsoft Intra ID Protection. The correct answers are Option B, Microsoft Purview Insider Risk Management, and Option C, Microsoft Purview Data Loss Prevention, DLP. Here's why. Microsoft Purview Adaptive Protection dynamically adjusts the strength of DLP controls based on the user's risk level. This requires integrating Insider Risk Management, which calculates the risk level based on anomalous activities, with Data Loss Prevention, which enforces the actual restriction, like blocking USB access. Why are the other options not correct? A. Data Lifecycle Management handles retention and deletion, not insider risk or DLP enforcement. D. eDiscovery is used for legal hold, search, and export of communications, not dynamic data protection. E. Intra-ID protection calculates sign-in and user identity risk, compromise, whereas insider risk management calculates malicious/accidental data theft risk. Adaptive protection uses the latter. Exam tip. Adaptive protection bridges the gap between Microsoft Purview Insider Risk Management and Purview DLP to dynamically enforce data security policies based on behavior. Question number 301. Scenario. Your organization utilizes Microsoft Defender for Cloud to secure a multi-cloud environment encompassing Azure, Amazon Web Services, AWS, and Google Cloud Platform, GCP. The security architecture must meet two specific goals. 1. Scan AWS EC2 instances for OS vulnerabilities and software inventory without deploying any agents to the instances. 2. Ingest native GCP security alerts, such as those from GCP Security Command Center, directly into Defender for Cloud. Complete the multi-cloud posture design by selecting the appropriate configuration. Complete each statement by selecting the appropriate option from its drop-down list. Statement 1. To scan the AWS EC2 instances without agents, configure the blank. The choices for Statement 1 are agentless scanning in Defender CSPM, Azure Arc for servers, or AWS Systems Manager. Statement 2. To ingest native GCP Security Command Center alerts, configure the blank. The choices for Statement 2 are GCP Native Connector in Defender for Cloud, Microsoft Sentinel GCP Data Connector, or Google Cloud Anthos. For Statement 1, the correct selection is agentless scanning in Defender CSPM, Agentless scanning reads cloud APIs and snapshots to discover vulnerabilities without overhead. For statement 2, the correct selection is GCP native connector in Defender for Cloud. The native GCP connector in Defender for Cloud natively supports ingesting GCP Security Command Center findings. Exam tip. Defender for Cloud multi-cloud posture relies heavily on agentless scanning and native cloud connectors for AWS and GCP environments. Question number 302. Scenario. An organization is maturing its zero-trust architecture by enforcing continuous access evaluation, CAE, within Microsoft Entra ID. The security architect is documenting how CAE changes the behavior of authentication tokens for Microsoft 365 applications like Exchange Online. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Statement 1. CAE allows Microsoft Entra ID to instantly revoke an active session if a user changes locations to an untrusted IP network. Statement 2. Because CAE evaluates access continuously, it eliminates the need for applications to use refresh tokens. Statement 3. CAE enforcement requires the target application, the resource provider, to be explicitly CAE capable. Statement 1. CAE allows Microsoft Entra ID to instantly revoke an active session if a user changes locations to an untrusted IP network. The answer is yes. Continuous access evaluation, CAE, evaluates critical events like location changes or account disablement in near real time, instantly revoking active access tokens. Statement 2. Because CAE evaluates access continuously, it eliminates the need for applications to use refresh tokens. The answer is no. Applications still use refresh tokens to obtain new access tokens. CAE extends the lifespan of the access token, but does not eliminate the OAuth token refresh architecture. Statement 3. CAE enforcement requires the target application, the resource provider, to be explicitly CAE capable. The answer is yes. To enforce CAE, the resource provider, for example, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, must be CAE capable to subscribe to and act upon the critical events from Entra ID. Exam tip. CAE forces near real-time token revocation based on critical events, but the client and resource provider must be explicitly CAE capable to utilize it fully. Question number 303. Scenario. A development team uses a GitHub Actions CI/CD pipeline to deploy infrastructure to Azure. Currently, the pipeline authenticates using an Azure Service Principal and a client secret stored in GitHub Secrets. The security team mandates that client secrets must no longer be used or manually rotated for this pipeline. You need to design an identity architecture that eliminates the client secret while maintaining secure, automated deployments. Which two configurations must you combine to achieve this? Select 2. The available options are as follows. Option A. Configure the GitHub Actions workflow to use OpenID Connect, OIDC, token authentication. Option B. Store a long-lived certificate in Azure Key Vault and reference it in the pipeline. Option C. Deploy an Azure Arc agent to the GitHub Actions runners. Option D. Configure a federated identity credential on the Microsoft Entra app registration. Option E. Enable managed identities for the GitHub repository. The correct answers are Option A. Configure the GitHub Actions workflow to use OpenID Connect, OIDC, token authentication, and Option D. Configure a federated identity credential on the Microsoft Entra app registration. Here's why. Workload Identity Federation uses OpenID Connect, OIDC, to allow GitHub Actions to request a short-lived access token directly from Microsoft Entra ID. You configure a federated identity credential on the Entra ID app registration to trust the GitHub repository, eliminating the need to store, manage, or rotate long-lived client secrets. Why are the other options not correct? B. Storing a certificate still requires lifecycle management, rotation, and does not eliminate the credential management overhead as effectively as Identity Federation. C. Azure Arc is used for managing on-premises/multi-cloud servers, not for authenticating CI/CD pipelines. E. Managed identities are tied to Azure resources, like virtual machines or app services. GitHub Actions runners are external to Azure, so they must use federated identity credentials, not managed identities. Exam tip. To eliminate secrets in external CI/CD pipelines, GitHub, GitLab, Terraform, always use workload identity federation via OpenID Connect, OIDC. Question number 304. Scenario. A global enterprise utilizes both Microsoft Defender XDR and Microsoft Sentinel. To improve SOC efficiency, the Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, wants analysts to use the Unified Security Operations Platform. Analysts must be able to view consolidated incidents, run advanced hunting queries across both XDR and SIEM data, and manage Microsoft Sentinel automation directly from a single interface. Complete the SOC architecture configuration by selecting the correct options. Complete each statement by selecting the appropriate option from its drop-down list. Statement 1. To access the Unified Security Operations Platform, SOC analysts should use the blank. The choices for Statement 1 are Microsoft Defender Portal, Azure Portal, or Microsoft Purview Portal. Statement 2. To ensure alerts, incidents, and investigation statuses are automatically synced between the SIEM and XDR, configure the blank. The choices for Statement 2 are Microsoft Defender XDR integration in Sentinel, Azure Logic Apps, or Log Analytics Data Export. For Statement 1, the correct selection is Microsoft Defender Portal. The Microsoft Defender Portal is the centralized interface for the Unified Security Operations Platform. For Statement 2, the correct selection is Microsoft Defender XDR integration in Sentinel. This integration creates the bidirectional bridge required for the unified SOC experience. Exam tip. The Unified Security Operations Platform lives inside the Microsoft Defender Portal and is powered by integrating the Sentinel workspace directly with Defender XDR. Question number 305. Scenario. An Azure App Service application is published through one approved Azure front door profile. The origin must reject direct internet requests and traffic forwarded through any other front door profile. For each statement, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Statement 1. Configure an app service access restriction rule that permits Azure front door backend traffic only when the Azure FDID header matches the approved front door profile. Statement 1. Configure an app service access restriction rule that permits Azure front door backend traffic only when the Azure FDID header matches the approved front door profile. The answer is yes. The service tag validates the front door backend path, and the header identifies the authorized profile. Exam tip. The front door service tag identifies the service. Azure FDID identifies the specific front door profile. Question number 306. Scenario. Administrators must manage Azure virtual machines through the Azure portal. The virtual machines must not have public IP addresses, and SSH and RDP access must remain unavailable until an authorized administrator requests a limited access window. Which two capabilities should the architect combine? Select 2. The available options are as follows. Option A, Azure VPN Gateway. Option B, just enough administration. Option C, Azure Bastion. Option D, just-in-time virtual machine access. Option E, Microsoft intra-PIM assignment to the virtual machine contributor role. The correct answers are Option C, Azure Bastion, and Option D, just-in-time virtual machine access. Here's why. Azure Bastion provides browser-based SSH and RDP through the Azure portal without requiring public IP addresses on the virtual machines. Just-in-time access keeps management ports blocked by default and temporarily permits approved connections when access is requested. Why are the other options not correct? A VPN provides broader virtual network access and does not independently enforce temporary management port authorization. B. Just enough administration limits PowerShell administrative capabilities, but does not provide the required portal connection path. EPIM can time-limit role activation, but the virtual machine contributor role neither provides the Bastion connection path nor directly implements network JIT access. Exam tip. Bastion secures the connection path. JIT controls when management port access is permitted. Question number 307. Scenario. A European engineering company hires developers located in Southeast Asia to administer Azure workloads. The developers currently connect to an on-premises jump server in Europe before reaching Azure, which creates high latency and a broad network trust boundary. The company wants an identity-aware zero-trust design that provides a modern remote desktop service, controls session host egress, and evaluates sign-in context. Which three components should the architect recommend? Select 3. The available options are as follows. Option A. Deploy an Azure Virtual Desktop host pool in an Azure region near the developers. Option B. Allow administration by using network security group rules based only on broad geographic IP ranges. Option C. Apply Microsoft intra-conditional access with multi-factor authentication and named locations. Option D. Route Azure Virtual Desktop host pool outbound traffic through Azure Firewall. Option E. Deploy another self-managed remote desktop server near the developers. The correct answers are Option A. Deploy an Azure Virtual Desktop host pool in an Azure region near the developers. Option C. Apply Microsoft intra-conditional access with multi-factor authentication and named locations. And Option D. Route Azure Virtual Desktop host pool outbound traffic through Azure Firewall. Here's why. Azure Virtual Desktop replaces the self-managed jump server and can be placed near users to reduce latency. Conditional access verifies identity and sign-in context, while Azure Firewall can filter and control host pool outbound traffic. Why are the other options not correct? B. Geographic IP filtering alone does not verify identity, device, or session risk and relies too heavily on network location. E. Another self-managed remote desktop server preserves the legacy jump host model and its maintenance and trust boundary limitations. Exam tip. A zero-trust remote access design combines a managed access plane, explicit identity verification, and controlled workload egress. Question number 308. Scenario. An organization is defining Microsoft Purview sensitivity label scopes for 3 distinct data protection scenarios. The design must use current Microsoft Purview scope classifications to protect document content, workspace containers, and structured data. Drag each current sensitivity label scope to the location for which it is the most appropriate. Use each scope once. The available source items are as follows. Source item 1. Groups and sites. Source item 2. Items. Source item 3. Schematized data assets. The destination requirements are as follows. Destination A. Documents stored in SharePoint Online and messages in Exchange Online. Destination B. Microsoft Teams workspace containers. Destination C. Azure SQL database columns registered in Microsoft Purview data map. The first correct mapping is items, mapped to documents stored in SharePoint Online and messages in Exchange Online. The second correct mapping is groups and sites, mapped to Microsoft Teams workspace containers. The third correct mapping is schematized data assets, mapped to Azure SQL database columns registered in Microsoft Purview data map. Here's why. Modern Microsoft Purview sensitivity label scopes dictate where a label can be applied. The item's scope protects files, SharePoint/OneDrive, and emails, Exchange. The groups and sites scope protects containers like Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365 groups. The schematized data assets scope extends labeling to structured data in Azure, like SQL, via the Purview data map. Exam tip. Remember the modern Purview scopes. Items covers both files and emails. Groups and sites covers containers, and schematized data assets handles structured multi-cloud/Azure data. Question number 309. Scenario. You are designing the network security perimeter for an Azure landing zone. The architecture hosts internet-facing web applications, standard virtual machines, and backend data services. You need to assign the appropriate Azure Network Security Service to mitigate specific attack vectors. Drag the appropriate Azure Network Security Service to its corresponding use case. Each service may be used once. The available source items are as follows. Source item 1. Azure Firewall Premium. Source item 2. Azure Web Application Firewall, WAF. Source item 3. Azure DDoS Network Protection. The destination requirements are as follows. Destination A. Inspect outbound HTTPS traffic for malware using TLS inspection. Destination B. Protect a public-facing Azure App Service from SQL injection and cross-site scripting, XSS. Destination C. Protect all virtual networks in the region from massive volumetric traffic floods and resource exhaustion attacks. The first correct mapping is inspect outbound HTTPS traffic for malware using TLS inspection. Map to Azure Firewall Premium. The second correct mapping is protect a public-facing Azure App Service from SQL injection and cross-site scripting, XSS. Map to Azure Web Application Firewall, WAF. The third correct mapping is protect all virtual networks in the region from massive volumetric traffic floods and resource exhaustion attacks. Map to Azure DDoS network protection. Here's why. Azure Firewall Premium provides Layer 7 features, including TLS inspection, to decrypt and scan outbound/inbound traffic for malware. WAF protects web applications, Layer 7 HTTP/HTTPS, against common web exploits like SQL and XSS. Azure DDoS network protection provides enhanced volumetric mitigation and alerting for entire virtual networks. Exam tip. TLS inspection and IDPS are features of Azure Firewall Premium. SQL injection and XSS mitigation belong to Azure WAF. You have completed Part 8 of the SC-100 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.